Hi. Every time we plan to go flying, we make a go, no-go decision. I think most people think of that decision as being very largely weather-based, and certainly in this video I'll talk about that aspect of it. But also, I'd like to broaden the discussion into many other decisions that we may be taking consciously or unconsciously, or indeed not at all. So, in this video, I'll cover weather, the most obvious starting point, but more nuanced than most people think. NOTAMs and the operational picture. You as the pilot, are you actually fit to fly? The aircraft, is it ready for this particular trip? Permissions and admin, the things that can quietly kill a plan. And finally, pressure and stress, something very close to my heart and the reason this video ends the way it does. Before I start, I'd like to mention the existence of quite a few flight risk assessment tools, or FRATs. These are apps or web forms which ask many questions about the forthcoming flight, aircraft and pilot, and reduce it to a single number representing its risk. I've put links to a few of them in the comments, and they're backed up by some very serious organisations such as the FAA, Cirrus and so on. They do form the backbone of a decision-making process, and I would advocate that you become familiar with them, but do bear in mind that they're a very blunt instrument, can only really give you an indication of how good an idea it might be to make a particular flight. If they come out red, you should be giving some very serious thought about where your score is negative. If they come out green, do bear in mind that that does not mean that your flight is bound to be perfectly safe and achievable. Right, starting with the weather, there are some things which are fairly obvious. If the weather at departure or destination is below minima, or if there are clear no-go factors such as freezing rain, then there's little judgment to be made, you're not going. Other factors are rather less obvious, such as thunderstorms, icing, crosswind, the availability of alternates where conditions are more benign. Also, of course, it's too simplistic to talk about a go, no-go decision. It's not just the whether go, but there's also what we might call the when go and where go. We might decide that our planned 7 a.m. takeoff is not attainable due to fog, but if we delay until 11 a.m. we can go. That brings with it all sorts of other considerations, and we'd really have to do most of a full replan to make sure that all the other factors we've taken into account based on the earlier departure are still okay, not least closing time at the destination. And we may decide that we're not going to be able to get into an airfield with an east-west runway, but we can get to one nearby with a north-south runway. But again, we need to start again thinking about permissions, slots, flight plans, immigration, ground transportation, fuel, and much more. So really, a full replan is required, and that replan takes time, and the time it takes must in itself be built into the calculation. The time it takes may preclude the flight in its own right. I guess I'm really saying that we're in the world of T-DODA, about which I've made a video linked in the description, which I do recommend you to watch as a good basis for such decision making. Also, I've made separate videos about each of the serious weather decision making factors, which are also linked in the description, so I don't plan to go into very much detail. But suffice it to say that the two most common reasons that light aircraft IFR pilots give for difficult decisions are thunderstorms and icing. However, there are excellent tools available to help us forecast and deal with them, and your decision making is going to be very largely based on your use of those tools. I do suggest looking at those videos. The next weather decision is to do with minima at destination and alternate. Again, I've made a video specifically about that, pointing out that there are not necessarily just one set of minima if you're making a discretionary flight. In other words, you're not a professional pilot flying to a strict set of company rules about when to make a flight and when you don't. Those minima apply to taking a decision at several distinct points: before departure, at the top of descent, as you begin the procedure, at decision altitude. In your own mind, each of these stages may have a different set of minima. For example, if you're flying a piston single, you might decide never to set off unless the forecast cloud base is greater than, say, 1,000 feet. However, you may decide that you're happy to descend if the cloud base is 600 feet and that you're willing to commence the approach if the cloud base is 400 feet. But that once you're actually on the approach, the safest thing to do is to go down to 200 feet. These are, of course, just examples. The decision is yours. My only point is that there's not one simple decision about cloud base that applies to the whole decision-making process. The last weather aspect of these decisions is wind, both surface wind and en route wind. With respect to surface wind, you need to be very clear about the limitations both on the aircraft and on you personally. Most of the aircraft that we fly do not have specific wind limitations. They're usually just a publication of what's been demonstrated in certification by a test pilot. That may be a number at the limits of the capability of the aircraft, but equally it may be just the manufacturers simply didn't have the opportunity of testing at stronger winds. So it's most important that you have your own idea of what you personally can do, as well as the point at which control authority, particularly of the rudder and fin, runs out. A particularly difficult judgment call is when gusting winds are forecast or reported. Remember that a gust may only last a few seconds and have happened only once in the last 10 minutes. The chances are very much in favour of the actual wind you encounter in the flare being closer to the steady wind than to the gusting wind, and your decision should probably be based on that. However, you should be ready for a situation where you're unable to make a landing and need to go elsewhere. That in itself may cause a no-go decision. You should also be aware that runway surface makes a big difference to the crosswind that you can tolerate. On an icy or snowy runway, it will be considerably less than on a wet or damp runway, which again will be much less than on a dry runway. You should also know whether the flight manual gives information about maximum tailwind components and have a good idea of the effect of a tailwind on your landing. Pilots with less experience can be shocked at how much extra runway is required, even with a fairly moderate tailwind component. I talk about the importance of tailwind landings in my video about circling. Regarding en route wind, this is generally the best forecast of all the criteria we're taking into account. You can be reasonably confident that the en route wind you encounter will be much as forecast over the days leading up to departure, and it should be baked into your fuel and time calculations. It therefore should not really form part of your on-the-day go-no-go decision, but could lead to replanning or even abandonment in the period leading up to departure. So far in this video, I've only really regurgitated things I've already made separate videos about, but let's move on to some non-weather related go-no-go decision making. The biggest short-term variable is to do with NOTAMs. Luckily, things have moved on enormously over the last 10 years. We now all have at our fingertips a clear map depiction of where there may be problems, but, of course, that doesn't help if we don't look at the appropriate moment. This is particularly true if our decision-making about other factors, particularly weather, has caused us to delay or reroute. Equipment fails, airspace gets closed or activated, runways get blocked, fuel runs out in real time, and if you've delayed or rerouted, even though you're now rushed, under pressure and feeling stressed, you must go back to your app of choice and go through the whole briefing process top to bottom. So much for weather and NOTAMs, the two things which are drilled into us as the fundamentals of the planning process. But let's now move on to the more delicate issue of you yourself. Let's start with the documentary check. Are your ratings current? Is your medical current? These are go, no-go items just as much as the cloud base. Next, are you fit to fly? I hope we're all familiar with the I'm Safe acronym, but how many of us really apply it assiduously and insightfully before each time we fly? I was really shocked very recently to be on a day trip with someone where I was not part of the crew, simply a passenger along for the ride. In all seriousness, he asked me at lunchtime if I minded if he ordered a pint of beer. Alcohol limits vary to some extent around Europe, but they generally lie somewhere between a quarter of the permitted limit for driving, which is really only there to allow for a small, naturally occurring variations in people's metabolism, and an absolute zero tolerance. I know from my experience in court that alcohol can stay in the system much longer than the 8 hours that some people consider to be the measure between bottle and throttle. Really, alcohol consumption and aviation don't go together at all, certainly not within a 24-hour period. And of course, you need to think about both safety and legal consequences of infraction. Both can be very serious. Are you sick or under the weather? If you've been ill, are you truly recovered? Post-viral fatigue can go on much longer than you might think. Fatigue, like alcohol and oxygen deprivation, has an awful way of covering its own tracks by, in itself, stopping you realising how unfit you are. Also, if you have recently been ill, your tolerance to low environmental pressure may well be reduced and your need for supplemental oxygen increased. If you are or have been taking any medication, that may well affect your judgment. Bear in mind that the half-life for some medication is deliberately long and may well affect you for some time after you stop taking it. What about your blood sugar? Has your rush meant that you've skipped breakfast? Has your concern about not wanting to be caught short on the flight meant that you have dehydrated yourself? Mental presence is the one most pilots skip. Are you truly focused at the beginning of the flight? Are you stressed about the business meeting that you have ahead of you? Are you stressed about the angry spouse you've left behind? Are you stressed about the flight itself? Are you really mentally present? And then, at the end of the day, after your business meeting, spending the day on the beach with the kids or walking around a museum, are you still sufficiently alert for the return flight? This is particularly important if it's in the dark and your circadian rhythms start cutting in. And don't forget that at the very end of the day you have to drive home. That may well be the most dangerous part of the trip if you're tired. When did you last fly? When did you last fly this particular type or on this particular kind of mission? When did you last fly at night? When did you last handle a strong crosswind? The list is endless. There is a similar checklist to be run through for the aircraft. Is the maintenance up to date? Is it still going to be in hours when you get back with an allowance for delay or diversion? Are there any known defects? Have you thought about your minimum equipment list for the trip you're about to do? For example, if you might be going into icing, do you know what in-flight failures you can take into known icing? If it has recently come out of maintenance, do you wish to undertake the trip you've planned? Do you want to discover that there is a maintenance-induced problem when you're 500 miles away from home? If you rent or share your aircraft, how much can you rely on your fellow pilots to have written up the defects? Is your nav database up to date? Is it properly fueled for the flight and reserves? Have you done your weight and balance? Before we move on to external pressure, my particular bugbear, we need to discuss permissions and admin just briefly. Is your flight plan filed and confirmed? Have you received confirmation for your slots or PPR? Similarly, if you're travelling across Schengen or other borders, do you have immigration and customs permissions? Have you got the required ETA for immigration? If you have a last-minute change of passenger, how does that affect your immigration position? If your departure is delayed, do the permissions need updating? Particularly if you're thinking of diverting to a different destination, what are the slot, PPR, customs and immigration corollaries of that decision? Indeed, do you have an alternative plan, which might include not going at all or taking public transport or a car? The last thing I'm going to talk about, probably more expansively than the relatively mechanistic decision-making I've just been discussing, is the question of pressure, both external and internal. I've encountered so many occasions where I've either made or experienced go decisions when they so obviously should have been no-go that I'd like to tell you some stories. Let's first of all talk about some categorization of the kind of pressure I'm talking about. Someone is actively pressuring you to go. That alone is a red flag. If you're in that position, sometimes it's even worth phoning a friend just to bounce off them the disquiet you're feeling and see what decision they would make given the conditions, but without the external pressure. Get there-itis. The importance of getting there, whether to you or a passenger, is affecting your judgment about the safety and risk balance of the flight. This can be particularly significant for work commitments, either at the destination or returning home in time. Peer pressure. You're going to an event with other pilots you know, and they're taking decisions to proceed based on their own experience, confidence, skill, or equipment level that you may not share. Sunk cost. You drove 2 hours, you've spent hours in planning and preparation as well as on fueling and pre-flight. Are you now deciding to go because it makes safety sense, or is it to avoid wasting the effort? Some people would advocate never booking hotels, car hire, or anything non-refundable until you arrive, such that that sunk costs argument doesn't lead to more bias towards setting off and ending up in the original planned destination. Normalisation of risk. We made it last time in similar conditions, or even worse, in conditions that were somewhat better than they are now. Asymmetric standards. Are you applying the same go-no-go criteria for the return flight as the outbound? These factors are easy to list, but much harder to recognise in yourself when it matters. So rather than leave them as abstractions, let me tell you what some of them actually look like in practice. Sometimes, ironically, it's greater experience that leads to a no-go decision rather than lower experience or capability. I remember years ago a large group of us were going to a grass strip associated with a hotel in the mountains near Dijon. The strip was 750 metres long, its elevation 1,500 feet, and France was suffering a heat wave of around 40 degrees centigrade. There were around 20 pilots and aircraft going, and all but 2 took the decision to go. 2 decided that the conditions for a hot and high departure from a grass strip were not sensible or safe, and that they would go to Dijon Airport and rent a car instead. The most interesting aspect of this decision-making was that all of those who went to the destination were private pilots, and the 2 people who decided not to go, but instead to go to the much larger airfield, were the only 2 professional pilots in the group. It's worth thinking about that. Another story concerns a technical issue which delayed departure from London to Sion by only about 3 hours, and then taking the decision to go without rechecking the weather. As it turned out, the weather was much worse than originally planned, and what should have been a simple flight in VMC became a difficult and potentially hazardous arrival under IFR in conditions which tested both the aircraft and the pilot. But my worst story concerns a go decision that could and should have been a no-go days before departure. Pressure, which I must say was coming from within myself rather than the passenger, led me to depart and resulted in an accident which wrote off the aircraft. My story has just about all the elements of a classic CRM accident: pressure, stress, fatigue, poor judgment, disbelief, and a whole series of small operational issues: weather, runway length, runway configuration, the classic Swiss cheese. And it started a long time before the crash itself. It was my 4th consecutive long-flying day. By Thursday, I had already flown London to Perpignan, then Mallorca, then back via Deauville, a fuel stop that turned into an age waiting for a Bowser. I didn't feel tired. That matters. A friend needed help. He was stranded on the Isles of Scilly, needing to get to a meeting in Essen, and had left his wife and 3 children, including a baby, alone in a rented cottage on Tresco. Getting there by public transport is virtually impossible. I said yes. The weather at Scilly on Thursday morning was filthy. Fog, low cloud. I set off from Biggin anyway, knowing fog tends to lift by lunchtime. When I first called Scilly, conditions were still very poor. I pressed on. Miraculously, as I reached the initial approach fix, they reported 3,000 metres and 600 feet. I got in. That lucky improvement set a trap for the following day. I'd been rewarded for pressing on. Friday dawned with filthy weather across most of the UK, worst in the southwest. My passenger wasn't putting pressure on me, not explicitly, but his situation was clear. His wife was isolated on a small island with 3 young children, no easy way off. I knew that he needed to get in. That gap between what someone needs and your ability to deliver it, that's stress, even when it doesn't feel like stress. Around Coxey, a VOR on the Belgian coast, we descended out of airways to fly low along the south coast, close enough for a phone signal, so that my passenger and student could research ferries and speedboats. No ferries, fully booked for days, no speedboats, weather, no contact with his wife, poor coverage on the island. So, there I was, flying at 1,000 feet, in IMC, threading between ATZs and CTRs along the south coast, waiting for half-hourly METARs from St Mary's. If that picture doesn't trigger a hard stop, I don't know what does. I didn't stop. Only 2 runways at St Mary's have instrument approaches, 27 and 32. The wind favoured 14, but there was no authorised approach to 14. Runway 32 meant a 10-knot tailwind on a short, humpback strip. I calculated that the steep upslope would compensate. I opted for 32. I flew it as a straight-in using the Garmin overlay with my passenger calling altitudes at range. Stable approach, sensible speed. At circling minima, solid IMC. I held the approach. At derived decision altitude, nothing. I began to apply power and raise the nose. Then, in the sink or a momentary clearance, I saw the pappies. 4 whites. I reduced power and put the nose down. We never got back to 2 reds and 2 whites. I flared a little after the numbers, but the speed was unstable and the tailwind was pushing us. We touched down at least 200 metres into the runway, fast. Full braking, squealing tires, but we couldn't stop. The far end was a precipice, so I turned off onto the grass. We were only doing about 5 or 10 knots. but the 2-inch lip from tarmac to grass was enough to take off 2 undercarriage legs. The fire service was there before we'd finished getting out. With hindsight, there are 11 points at which I could have prevented this. 1. Decided that 4 long flights in 4 days was too much to plan. 2. Decided that a 4th hard day, already fatigued, was a bad idea. 3. Not departed on Friday, given the weather, or at least planned Newquay as destination. 4. Consciously excluded my passenger distress from my decision-making. 5. Recognised that flying IMC at 1,000 feet down the south coast meant that I'd already pushed too far. 6. Recognised that flying IMC at 1,000 feet down the south coast was adding to my fatigue. 7. Raised my personal minima after such a difficult and stressful flight. 8. Continued the missed approach once I'd started it. 9. Gone around immediately on 4 whites. 10. Gone around after floating before touchdown. And 11. Converted to a touch and go after touching down long. 11 slices of Swiss cheese, every one of them with a hole that lined up. Why did this happen? I can point to specific factors: the previous day's miraculous clearance, the passenger situation, accumulated fatigue I genuinely didn't feel. But the most honest answer is this: I'd thought carefully about 2 possible outcomes, landing at destination or landing at the alternate. I gave almost no thought to the other 3, not departing, running out of fuel, or crashing. And I didn't think I was going to crash. Not at any point. Not until less than a second before I did. That's not a weather problem. It's not a skills problem. It's what get there itis actually looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like pressure. It doesn't feel like poor judgment. It feels like optimism. Fatigue and stress are invisible when you're inside them. We apply objective limits to hypoxia and carbon monoxide poisoning. Above this altitude, you are hypoxic regardless of how you feel. We need the same thinking for fatigue. If I've flown for more than 3 hours on 3 consecutive days, I'm fatigued regardless of how I feel. Same goes for pressure. Somehow we must learn to recognise the mindset that says, I must get in, and meet it with the thought, the circumstances under which I truly must get in are very rare. There is probably an alternative. I sit here and say this just as I tell my students the same things, but when I needed it most, I didn't apply any of it. Not because I forgot, because I never recognised that I was in that situation at all. That is the real lesson. It could have happened to any of us. So, that's been quite a brain dump, but I do hope that I've managed to at least widen your thinking about what goes into that go or no go, and where and when to go decision. See you in the next video.